We're at myth 3, which means that we're bundling together presentations into groups of 4s, and then we're taking 3 groups of 4s and making a set. And we're going to make, in the course of our learning, 8 sets. But in order for those sets not to interfere with each other, not in terms of content and not in terms of form, but in terms of resonance, we intersperse a 13th presentation as an interval between 2 sets of 12, because we're generating a learning and not delivering an instruction. We're not interested in the old architecture of education. We're interested in the new cosmos and art of learning, which we have had imposed upon us because of the developments of the past 300 years. Ever since Sir Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, our capacity to analyze has outstripped our ability to integrate. And the differential analytical capacities have been limited to just a few, just a frost on humanity. And now in the 21st century, with computers and networking, the internet and things to come, the whole world will be real or not, depending upon whether its population can master this, and not master the new analytic to the expense of the old tradition, the old wisdom, the ancient wisdom, and not ancient wisdom of any one particular lineage, but the planet as a whole, many together, several dozen, and at least half a dozen that are major, almost equal to each other. So the myth 3 is the third of the first group of 4 in the set of myth. And previous to that, we did 2 sets of 12. We did a set of 12, 3 groups of 4 on nature, because we found we had to begin with nature. And that the beginning with nature was mysterious, because nature was not at all objective, but was simply a process of undeterminable dynamic that generated itself in such a way that its beginning was 0 and not 1. About 25 years ago, one of the early geniuses in computer program, a Dutchman named Dijkstra, in his little book on programming, began with chapter 0 before chapter 1, so that one had the ability to generate the first that you could count out of an uncountable openness. So that 0 and 1, we found, had a very interesting relationship, that while the first set of 12, nature, had a 0 index, the second 12 on ritual had a unifying, a 1 index. And now with myth, we are discovering that it has a 2 index. Not just 2 as in 2 or in dual, but 2 as in symmetry and pairing. Relational, to the extent that the pairing can be proportionate and eventually deliver in the next set of 12 will be symbols. And in symbols, one finds that the pairing in myth becomes a ratioability, becomes rational. And with those 4, we will have gone through a whole ecology of integral, from nature to ritual to myth to symbol, is an ecology that has as its mode integration all the way through. And yet we're only then halfway through, because arriving at the symbolic mind, we will have gone halfway in the real. And that the other half is a complement to it, a complement to the integral mode, and that is the differential mode. And in many ways, ancient wisdom had the differential mode as a counter strophe to the strophe of the integral. And so the ancient chorea, the choreographic dance of classical Greece, would have a movement around almost to the closure of a circular movement, and then there would be a pivot. And that pivot would turn and go counterclockwise back the other way. And that pivot, though originally it was called a stand, and when you see early Greek tragedy, or you see the quality in some of the later Greek writers, the term is strophe, counterstrophe, and stand. And yet, one genius right at the beginning, along with Aeschylus, a contemporary of his, the great classical Greek lyric poet Pindar, did not have a stand. He had a dynamic pivot. And so in Pindar's poetry was the first cue that while there is a stand between strophe and counterstrophe in the mind, in a differential person, it is not a static stand, but is instead a pivot of transform. And so one finds in Pindar's poetry an acrobatic language for the very first time that staggered the ancient world. And anyone who has ever attempted to translate Pindar has come up understanding that this is almost an impossible task, because his poetic is so flexible and athletic that he does pirouettes high wire with language that even into our own time seem unbelievable. The first group of people to really be able to translate Pindar were the French, gathered around Stéphane Mallarmé and the following generation of Paul Valéry. And you found in them symbolic poetry for the first time that delivered something. It delivered an active, energetic imagery that transforms as it occurs and continues to transform, continues to metamorphosize itself. And so we're looking at myths in a very interesting way. We're trying to understand two classic mythology eras. One of them, the classical Greeks, because they are of perennial interest to us, and they found a lot of the bad habits which we have inherited and a lot of the good qualities that we aspire to. But we're pairing, and we're not using just anything, we're using Jane Ellen Harrison's Prolegomena to the Study of Greek Religion. Because when it was first published at Cambridge University, 1903, Jane Ellen Harrison was one of the most incredibly interesting classicists. She was the first woman to really become, in the British school system, an equal intellectually with the men. And by the time she published the third edition in 1922, she was one of the most lionized figures in the literary world. One of the books on her is Ritual Myth in the Modernist Text, The Influence of Jane Ellen Harrison on Joyce, Eliot, and Virginia Woolf. She changed literature permanently and changed art. And in fact, her early love was for Greek art, not for philosophy, but Greek art. And because she was a woman, very often she had to do her own research without contacting confreres until she became famous. And then everyone wanted to speak to Jane Ellen Harrison. And she became the model for Virginia Woolf for figures like Mrs. Dalloway. Her early concern was with the Greek art, not in its simple outlining, and by her time in the late 1890s, it was understood that the Greek aesthetic in art was particular in the ancient world in that it liked to outline simply. It liked to do boundedness. And one of the great illustrators for Homer, Flaxman, had illustrations that were just a simple outline of the various illustrations to the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the masterful French figure who took a Pindaric poetic into drawing the line Matisse would draw lines that were so acrobatically vibrant that it startled the world at the time. Not only for his great color, his fauve color, but the Matisse line is one of the triumphs of modern art. Jane Ellen Harrison was one of those figures who took the clear Greek line and applied it to mythology and found that there are no clear lines in mythology. The clear lines are in the rituals. And that if you want to understand the mythology, you have to go back and you have to inform yourself, what did they do while they were telling these stories? What steps did they go through and where? And so the school, it's called the Myth and Ritual School, and this particular study says the leader of it was Sir James George Fraser, also at Trinity College, Cambridge. But the intellectual guide was Jane Ellen Harrison. Fraser was like the encyclopedist with the golden bough and all of his enormous works, but it's the insightfulness of Jane Ellen Harrison who puts her finger on it. She says the Greek word dromenon, which means the thing done. If you are telling this myth, what is it that you're doing while you're telling this myth? And one of the great interesting things is that when we look at an ancient mid-3rd millennium BC storyteller, it is a woman. Because in the mid-3rd century BC, the first great writer in the world was a woman. And her name was Inanna. She was the daughter of Sargon the Great of Akkad, and her father's empire spread from sea to shining sea, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, the Fertile Crescent. And it was Sargon of Akkad who ran the first great caravan routes all the way down from along the Persian Gulf, up the Tigris and Euphrates, into Anatolia, because that's where a lot of the metal mines were, to get the very, very valuable copper. And the tin that you needed to make bronze didn't come from there, but came down from by the Persian Gulf and the Iranian highlands. And he was one of the first people to put together the two metals so that you could get bronze, and bronze was a big commercial commodity in those days. Not just gold for its splendor, but bronze because you could make implements like swords that enforced the projection of your power, and helmets that could withstand the old swords. And so the first great Fertile Crescent empire was one of international contacts linked by very long caravan routes. They had never been seen this way before. Before Sargon of Akkad, though there were some caravan routes, the longest ones were usually by ships going on the sea coast. This was overland. following the curve of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers up and arcing over and coming very close to the Syrian highlands. And once one got there, one could go down another river valley, the Jordan River Valley, and go down and make contact with the Egyptian civilization. So that Enkiduanna's father ran this enormous complex empire going from the Persian Gulf all the way up to Anatolia, over to the Mediterranean, where Syria and Lebanon are, down through what is today Israel, down to Egypt. And one had, for the very first time, an enormous complex of peoples and traditions and civilizations. And in this, vying for supremacy, were various gods. And for Enkiduanna, the god was a goddess, Inanna. She was the center. And so we're taking Inanna, Enkiduanna's great mythic cycle of the goddess of heaven and earth, Inanna. And it's interesting because the most ancient name for the goddess of the entire earth with heaven's conforming blessing, her ancient name was Anahita. And so Anna becomes the key, and it's Enkiduanna, Inanna, Anna, and many different cognates from that. So we're pairing Jane Ellen Harrison, Prolegomena to the Study of Greek Religion, because we're trying to understand mythology in a very deep way, with Diane Volkstein's translation of the Inanna hymns and epic in connection with Samuel Noah Kramer. He was the great university authority on the Sumerians, great translator. She was the great poetic artist who could take his translations and put them together with a Pindaric-like poetic, and one has, for the very first time, translations like this. This particular hymn to Inanna begins, its title is From the Great Above to the Great Below. From the great above, she opened her ear to the great below. Why her ear first? Because language is an oral witness in the present, presenting of it in the flow of experience. And we'll see that, like nature, myth is a process. But it is the process of languaged feeling in images that flow, but they do not have to flow in a straight line. They can if you follow the ritual word for step, but they can disengage themselves so that the flow then becomes free form. And when it becomes free form, it tends to have a variety of resonance clustering around an approximate shape, but not a form. And so one has in mythology always variations, variants. There are many different ways to tell the story of Orpheus. And we saw last week, I brought in a volume published in Sweden about 50 years ago on the Orpheus myth in the North American Indian tradition. Many of the mythic themes, and these are themes, themes upon which a variation can be built, like Haydn's variations or Brahms' variations. Living mythologies are always variations. And their variant is in a rhythm that allows for there to be a ritual traction to it in the rhythm of the storytelling or of the myth-telling, but one is free then to embellish, to emphasize. There is still in Africa the Storytellers Canes from West Africa that are used to make the beat, to keep the rhythm. And I'll bring next week a Storyteller's Cane from the Cameroons in, and one can see, yes, it is a very interesting cane where all the various ebony parts are interspaced with a kind of different material that allows for the Storyteller's cane to be flexible, and the handle of it is a particular shape. It's the shape of the ancient scepter from ancient Egypt. Still today, still there. So that a great deal of Black African wisdom goes back many thousands of years and is in the dynamic movement of the doing of it with agility, with flexibility. And one finds the greatest of the West African poets and storytellers, the Nigerians especially, Amos Tutola, and the whole idea that there is a kind of a surrealistic resonance possibility for things. And in Achebe or Tutola, or in the surrealistic poetry of César Aimé, taking the French symbolist with the West African surrealist tradition, all of a sudden one comes out with very interesting kind of a poetic that goes all the way back before classical Greece. Goes back to ancient Egypt, but to ancient Egypt at the time when it made its contact with the great Fertile Crescent. Because when one goes back to very Old Kingdom Egypt, you find it based on ritual. And you find pyramids that have a geometricity that is very form-oriented. But when you get to the age of the contact between the ancient Akkadians and the Egyptians of 1,000 years later, one finds a different kind of a figure. One finds a figure like Amenophis III, who is now being recognized and realized as the real pharaonic genius, and not his son Akhenaten. It's Amenhotep III, who is called the Dazzling Sun, and was one of the most incredible figures of all time. And his wife, Queen Tai, was black. She was a Nubian from Africa. So that there is, in the time of Amenhotep III, the beginnings of the realizing that it is the dazzling sunlight distributed and glinting everywhere in magnificent grandness that is important, rather than the geometricity of a purely static shape like a pyramid. One finds the great flexibility. Linking the feminine ancient Middle East with the masculine Egyptian was a particular caravan route that came from the crest of the Tigris River, where it branched into northern Anatolia, sent a chute over to the Mediterranean by Lebanon, and sent an inland passage down through what is today Israel. And that city was called Haran. And Haran is the city of the moon, Inanna, great moon goddess. And the man who ran the caravan routes out of Haran was named Terah, and he passed his business on to his son, and his son's name was Abraham. And it was his son, Abraham, that he sent to make sure that the contact of the caravan route with Egypt was secured. And so the ancient Jewish tradition begins with Abraham, because he is the first to interface in a very fundamental way the feminine ancient Near East of Persia, Akkadia, Sumeria, with the masculine patriarchal tradition of Egypt. And it is this improbable, unannealable conflict that characterizes for about 4 generations. The recounting of it, of course, is in Genesis. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. And Joseph becomes the great master of grain in Egypt because he understood. He understood the grain goddess, understood how to deal and prepare. And it wasn't just masculine power that you project, it is life that you protect by bringing the reserves in, by looking ahead, by consulting astronomy and astrology, and seeing that there are large cycles to life, and that while there'll be 7 years of plenty, there'll be 7 years of drought, and you have to prepare now for that. And this 7 is a very, very deep thing, because in the hymns of Inanna, 7 is the set, is the cycle of her collecting of what in ancient Akkadian was called the May, M-E, but pronounced May. And the May were the ritual figures of empowerment that one accumulates together so that one's character then exemplifies these resonances together as the harmonic of their influence. And here in From the Great Above to the Great Below are the 7 by Enneduanna of Inanna, the moon goddess. She placed the Shugara, the crown of the steppe, on her head. She arranged the dark locks of hair across her forehead. She tied the small lapis beads around her neck, let the double strand of beads fall to her breast, and wrapped the royal robe around her body. She daubed her eyes with ointment called Let Him Come, Let Him Come, bound the breastplate called Come Man, Come around her chest, slipped the gold ring over her wrist, and took the lapis measuring rod and line in her hand. And so she acquires these 7. And these 7 together constitute and make the ritual comportment, action objectivity that now is able to generate the experience of the goddess. But in order for the goddess to do a very special kind of development, she must divest herself of all 7, and it's called the descent of Inanna. Not only from heaven to the earth, but there is from earth down into the center of the netherworld, the center of the afterworld. And that nether afterworld, in order to reach that, she must go back through the process and divest herself progressively of all 7, so that when she arrives at the nadir, she is completely nude. She is denuded of all of her, not symbols of power, but of her ritual objectivities that allowed her to be the goddess in the experience of the mythic horizon. And so she arrives there completely bereft of any kind of ritual traction, as if one going to the center of the earth now experiences no gravity. One is suspended, and there she meets her sister Ereshkigal, who is the queen of hell, the queen of the netherworld. And she cannot leave, because once you are there, it's like a kind of demonic flypaper. You can't leave. How can you leave? There's no way to leave. You have no traction. You have no ritual objectivity by which you could begin to go. You have no experience. You are completely suspended without it. And one of the qualities in ancient wisdom was that at the center of hell, the devil is not like some kind of romantic, robust, super sly, pitchfork wielding thing, but the devil is evil because of being a non-person, of being neuter, is a neuter character that any contact with shorts out your sexuality. It's not that the devil likes sex, likes oblivion. So that the burnt out cinder figures, the burnt out matchstick figures in the side of illustrations like the Book of Kells, this is really evil. It is evil because contact with it blanks you into oblivion. It's not about sin, it's about nothingness. And so a whole quality begins to play in the Inanna works, and in order for her to be able to return back to the earth, and return back to the earth so that it has its heavenly contact again, vis-a-vis the moon cycles, the feminine and the moon cycles and the heavenly, she must have a new way to leave, and the new way is the exchange. That Dumuzi comes and takes her place. And because he comes and takes her place, that place without traction is occupied, and she then is able to return. And of course, we see in this later on the great myths of Persephone returning from Hades. But as Jane Helen Harrison points out in her Prolegomena, this is the classic third edition of 1922, she says there is another figure that fits into this scenario, but is a masculine who goes to try to bring her back, and the emphasis is on the masculine. His name is Orpheus. And so the whole last third of her book is all about the mysteries of the Orpheus. And paired with Orpheus is Dionysus, because she says there's something enormously complex going on here, and she was the first one to really bring this out. And in 1903, it was like an unheard of, it was like splitting the atom, that there's a connection between Demeter and Dionysus. Just as then there's a connection between Persephone and Eurydice and Orpheus. And how is that connection? And she begins by saying, at the very beginning of her book, let's talk about two different kinds of rituals. Let's talk about Olympian rituals and then Sithnonic rituals. Let's talk about the Olympian gods and those Sithnonic earth gods. And she says, when we look at ancient Greek religion, we find, like in their art, a very clear simplicity. There's no sense in their religion of purification or sin. It's of doing the rituals right at the places where they should be done. And so one finds things, this is the first of 5 volumes by L.R. Farnell, The Cults of the Greek States, and it's all about gods and goddesses and how they're worshipped and where, at cult sites. And in the big city centers, they were cult sites that very often were in temples. And so the Greek temple is a cult site, and there is where is performed the rituals, and then is told the myths and the mythologies. And in this development is a very interesting kind of realization. She says the word that we always thought meant cure, like therapy, in Greek therapeia, at that time in classical Greek meant service. That man services the gods. So that Socrates in Plato's Euthyphro says it's like a business deal. Yeah. We do this for them, they do this for us. And Socrates challenged that. But Jane Ellen Harrison says that behind this therapy, this therapeia as service, is another word, haunting like a shadow, And that word, daimonia, means fear of spirits, fear of the supernatural. The gods are a part of the Greek mythological naturalness, but the demons, the daimonia, this is the supernatural. And the supernatural exceeds the natural, so that one's mythic health, though when it flows parallel to nature, then everything is natural. The demonic spirits are not natural, and you are not guaranteed that by following nature in your experience, in your images, in your feelings, being natural about your feelings, that it's going to be any protection whatsoever, because the demonic spirits come from a whole different realm. They come from a realm beyond the mind. They come from the mysteriousness of upper, different, ordered, visionary life that we today call consciousness. But it's a differential consciousness and runs counter to the integral of nature, runs counter to the healthy common sense of experience, is in fact not just a contact with something higher, but a contact with something that you contacted, it changes you, it transforms you. That anything, and so they called it magic. So the spiritual demonic was always associated with the process of magic, the magic flow. And one had to be careful of this, because even the gods are subject to be changed against their will by magic. Let's take a break and we'll come back. Let's come back and reacquaint ourselves just briefly that the process that we're doing is an inquiry that improves itself as it goes along, and that it has the possibility of algorithmic refinement. But it's not just for some kind of a flow chart, but there are very subtle qualities that are being generated. In astrophysics sometimes, some of them are called density waves. And there is an art to learning in this way. And there's a mathematic to it. And so one of the things that helps us to go for an entire year, an entire annual cycle, is to do a distributed reading of a journey. And we're using, for the first year, we're using 3 possibilities. One of them there's no video of. There's no reading of it, and that is Lady Murasaki's great The Tale of Genji, written about 1,000 years ago, and one of the greatest literary works in the world. And the whole idea is not just to read it, but to read in it over a year's time, patiently, little bit by little bit by little bit, to get the sense of a distributed reading, so that a book is not just a text, but becomes a field of one's comportment, of one's experience, of one's understanding. And the second item, of course, is Homer's The Odyssey, and Richmond Lattimore's great translation is read here on Caedmon by Anthony Quayle, one of the great actors from the Old Vic. And there was a wonderful film made of Ulysses with Anthony Quinn and Kirk Douglas. And it is actually a very good film, even though it has the gritting smile of Kirk Douglas and the surly musculature of Anthony Quinn. It is a very interesting, good film. The third is Moby Dick by Melville, and the classic film done by John Huston, screenplay by Ray Bradbury. starring Gregory Peck. They remade it with Patrick Stewart. It's not anywhere near what Huston's Moby Dick is. There are lots of readings of Moby Dick. This Charlton Heston, but the best reading is Moby Dick read by Burt Reynolds. And you would think it would not be so, but there are times when people are ready for something, and Burt was ready for Melville. I know it sounds strange. And then to give us a key for the whole phase, we use music. The music for myth is Scheherazade, Rimsky-Korsakov, from the Arabian Nights. And even the intervals have their own music, and the music for interval 2 was the MJQ, Modern Jazz Quartet's Pyramid. In between ritual and myth, the MJQ's Pyramid will do one of the great things here is How High the Moon, composed by John Lewis and presented by his group. We also used films. Each phase has its own films. We're using 4 films for each phase. One of the myth films is called The Bride with White Hair, a Chinese myth. And they even made Bride with White Hair 2 because it was so successful. And if you haven't seen Chinese cinema, you will enjoy The Bride with White Hair. The second is from Africa, South America, Black Orpheus. And one of the world's great films. And of course, the music of Black Orpheus is still perennial bestseller. And then we use 2 films that are linked together in American Western mythology. The first of them is Red River, Howard Hawks' great epic of the rise of the cattle empires in the American West. And then the follow-up is Shane, the gunman who has to protect the sod busters who fight against the cattlemen, because now agriculture is replacing the wild cattle drive men. So these are films and music and books to help us, and each bundle of 4 presentations has a pair of books that we use, and we pair them up so that we don't use them as books that are texts, because we're not looking for instruction. We're not even looking for edification. We're looking to generate a field of inquiry that keeps resonantly interpenetrating, developing its density waves, developing all of its capacities to deliver both a harmonic and a discontinuity, if need be. Arnold Schoenberg once said of dissonance that it is only dissonant to the limited ear, that dissonance in the wider universe has hidden harmonic. And of course, since Mandelbrot's wonderful fractal sets, we now know that there is nothing so chaotic and random that if stretched far fast enough, it will make a very interesting kind of a resonant quality of double attractor, infinity sign, double cycle, just like our education is, 2 years, an integral and a differential that are entangled, to use the current physics word, in such a way that they influence each other all the time. And it is only when we are teasing it out in a complementarity that we begin to realize we're involved in something that is doubly mysterious. Nature itself is mysterious, but we are mysterious as well. And it's not just the observer interfering with the observed. It's that the observer transforms the observed, transforming the observer back and forth in a very interesting kind of dramatic cosmos quality. When we see bronze face masks, here is of a woman of the time of Inanna, you see even here the quality of a very attentive type of human being. And when we see the bronze face mask of Sargon, the Great of Akkad, we see a royal personage indeed. And we also see Semitic features. And we realize that there is a great deal of hidden mysteriousness that surfaces between the ancient Akkadians of Sargon's day and his daughter Inanna and the later efflorescence of the first great Jewish literary tradition that centers around the figure of David and his Psalms and his son Solomon and his Song of Songs. And David's hymns are very deeply affine to the ancient wisdom hymns, hymns of praise, hymns of lamentation. And last week we read Sir Philip Sidney's 23rd Psalm as an example of how the Elizabethan Renaissance began to hone its poetic on being able to read Greek, Hebrew, and English, and Latin, and French all at the same time. Almost all educated people at that time were at least trilingual. They could read Hebrew for themselves. They could read Greek for themselves, as well as Latin. This quality introduces then the ancient poetic looping back into the current, and Elizabethan English is so vastly different from the generation before it that it's almost a new language. If you read early 1500s English poetry, it's still carrying the genius and burden of Chaucer some 200 years before. But when you come to Sidney and Spenser and Shakespeare, all of a sudden, English becomes a cosmic language. It dazzles to the point that for almost 200 years, no one could match it. And it isn't until you get to people like Shelley that you get the first indications of moving beyond a Shakespearean English. And of course, Shelley is one of the world's great translators of Greek. He translated his own Prometheus bound so that he could do his Prometheus unbound to finish what Aeschylus had finished in antiquity and then was lost. He rewrote it. And you find this introduction then of poetics from other times, other ages at the apex being able to not just be factored in again, but to come into play creatively, because a poetic is a differential magic language and not an integral mythic language. The Song of Songs of Solomon from 1000 BC is actually a set of 14 hymns that are put together, and the first 7 hymns go to the consummation of the Arabian princess with King Solomon, and the second set of 7 is her moving from just being the chosen consummate woman of the night, a la Scheherazade, to becoming the queen of the land. And so the Song of Songs is about Inanna resurfacing again, not only being able to go into the netherworld of the erotic night, but to bring herself back through empowerment of that erotic night back to becoming the queen of the land, of restoring the land. So that what is restored here is not just life, that we're going to make it, but love in life, that we are going to make it grandly. We're going to live beautifully with each other. And so ancient Inanna resurfaces again in the Psalms of the Song of Songs of Solomon. There are study in the language of love, in the Song of Songs and ancient Egyptian poetry, ancient Egyptian love songs, but the real deep influence is the Inanna Mideastern tradition going all the way back. And one finds then, resonant with that ever after, hidden until about the turn of the millennium, about 20 BC in Alexandria, one finds the wisdom of Solomon, where Inanna surfaces again, but this time she surfaces as wisdom herself, Sophia. But a Sophia that has the ability to protect one against adversarial forces, as well as to nourish one to natural forces. And one finds books like Wisdom and Cult, or Hellenistic influences on the Book of Wisdom and its consequences, and a whole literature develops. One of the earliest great writers understanding this Solomonic literature before a lot of it was discovered or translated, Moncure Daniel Conway, 1899, Solomon and Solomonic literature. And of course, Conway is the great writer on occult magic ritual things, an American genius source of that. What's important for us is to understand in mythology, there is a mythology that is natural, that develops in consonance with nature out of ritual. There is another element in mythology that is protective against the supernatural, that comes from something hidden initially in mythology, and that it comes from the symbolic mind. Because that magic comes back through, and now one has a different counter current, almost like an undertow. One has a ritual magic. And the ritual magic is all for gaining the power to command the gods and men at the same time as defending against any other supernatural forces. And so one has a kind of a mix. And you get a thing of where the tide is running out, you get a rip current in mythology that comes out of this, and then you get a change, and Jane Ellen Harrison points out. This is where, in Greek mythology, they stop talking about Zeus and they start talking about Dionysus. They stop talking about Apollo and they start talking about Orpheus. And that there's something deeply disturbing about it, but illuminating about it. When he was stranded in the First World War in the South Pacific, in the Trobriand Islanders, the great anthropologist Malinowski wrote a big 2-volume book on the Trobriand Islanders, and it was called Coral Gardens and Their Magic. Yes, the gardens are there to provide the food, but they're all protected all the time by magic patrols, making sure that their charms and their curses against those who are trying to do you in are all in place and all working. So one gets an enormous tapestry, and mythology is not at all the simple thing that it's talked about and meant to be, assumed. And one of the great classic locuses of the translation into English of Daemonia is Superstition, and one finds here in Plutarch in the Moralia his on superstition. And it begins, just a few sentences, ignorance and blindness in regard to the gods divides itself at the very beginning into 2 streams, of which the one produces in hardened characters, as it were in stubborn soils, atheism, and the other in tender characters, as in moist soils, produces superstition. So that what is the protagonist in mythology is the character. It's not the person, it is not the individual. It is the character. And so experience has a character protagonist which introduces a characteristic grouping of experience, grouping of images, grouping of feelings all the time, and one has to be attentive to this. Sir James George Frazer, we all know about the Golden Bough, but he has a great book on superstition. It's called Psyche's Task, a discourse concerning the influence of superstition on the growth of institutions. Because it isn't just that superstition is in the culture, in the mythology, it is also then like an indelible stain in the social institutions. They receive the deepest deposit of it. And so you have not just a mythic culture developed from ritual, but you have a deeply superstitious set of social institutions that are trying to protect against things beyond, process beyond their control without a little bit of ritual magic. And so one begins to see in classical Greece, there is a very deep problem in the 5th century BC. And that's why you have figures like Thucydides and Plato and Socrates and Euripides and Sophocles, famous for his balance, because for one brief shining decade there was a Periclean balance seemingly in Athens, and they built the Acropolis to be the perfect building for the virgin goddess. The Parthenon is for the Partheninos, the virgin Athena. The building is not straight up and down, post and beam, but all of the columns and all of its structure is slightly bent inward, so that there is the sense that the Parthenon was built like a great temple on the principle of hulls of ships. It held together because its structure was like that of a drum rather than a post and beam structure, and stood the test of time until in the Turkish-Greek wars of a couple hundred years ago, the Turks stored their ammunition, and when it exploded, that's why the Parthenon looks like it's in ruins, because it sustained a huge inner bombardment and is still standing. It was really built well. But before that Sophoclean balance is that Aeschylus, eagle, Pindar, acrobatic, poetic, of trying to find a way to keep in the dynamic, because if you ever stopped, you would never be able to reacquire it. And so you have to keep going. And so the Greek spirit in the early 400s BC is all about keeping the dynamic going. Whereas Sophocles, for a little while, lets the dynamic acquire a balanced energy form. And then, because they couldn't keep the Aeschylean dynamic going and they couldn't maintain the Sophoclean balance, the whole latter part of the 400s belongs to Euripides, where one sees progressively that they realize that they are losing it big time, all the time, despite enormous efforts and genius. They are sliding into something, and Euripides' last play that we used in ritual, the Bacchae, is all about men who try to jawbone their way through difficulties in some kind of false Aeschylean vitality, or those who pretend that everything is okay in some kind of faux Sophoclean balance, when everything is actually leading to a very tragic outcome. The Athens of the day, of course, lost the Peloponnesian War, but that was just losing a 45-year battle with Sparta. What they lost was their ability to maintain love in life. And progressively, one finds, even in the masterful writer of the day, Plato, a drying out of his creative energies until the last dialogue of Plato, the Laws, is a huge, boring compendium. A kind of huge, boring compendium that one finds in ancient Babylonian literature, the Code of Hammurabi. Because when Duana's Inanna, erotic love in life, ability to make everything interesting, atrophied permanently, one then got about 1900 BC, the Code of Hammurabi. You do this, you lose a hand. You do it again, you lose your life. The Sharia. A severe encodement of ritual behavior so that your experience will toe our lines, because we have no confidence in anybody being able to be real outside of these lines. And so you must be corralled. You must be kept in place. And so the very motive of tyranny is placed not in some bad ruler, but in a tyrannical judiciary. And of course, the big inheritor of the Code of Hammurabi is the Lex Romanum, Roman law, which still forms the basis of English law and Napoleonic Code and many, many law-related infractions on love and life that we suffer even into the 21st century. The only place where the experience of all that is available for initial appreciation is in the mythologies. And one has to go to the mythologies not with some kind of follow your bliss, gaga-ness, but with that kind of incisiveness that Jane Ellen Harrison had. What is it that they are doing while they are using these images, using these mythic characters? What are the ritual figures behind the characters of experience? So that there are characteristics of characters because there are indelible existentials that really happen, and we have to know what they are. So it isn't just the ritual myth school. It's that there is a tandem here that we are now able to disclose to ourselves, because we have phases that alternate in a syncopation. We have a phase of form that comes out of a phase of process. Existence comes out of nature, but existence is formed. It's formal, it has structure. Because it doesn't remain in the dynamic, it changes the dynamis into an energeia, and energy then is able to take form as matter because it polarizes. A dynamic is not polarized, it's a flow. But an energy that is polarized is able to be collected into existential structure. Now it's energy tied not into a knot as this piece of matter, but it keeps emerging so that there's an iterative function to its existence, so that objectivity is not static but is iterative. And because it is iterative, its resonances are always collected slightly around the precision, so that it's only the rapid iteration that allows for all of those resonances to appearances to assume its perfect form. It's just like some body, like an asteroid that comes close to a planet, say like Triton did to Neptune several billion years ago. Triton was way out in what we know now as the Kuiper Belt. And when it first got captured by the gravity of Neptune, its orbit became a great hyperparaboloid, and over several billion years, its orbit shrank so that it's almost perfectly circular now around the planet. And one would say, well, moons have circular orbits around planets, and planets circular orbits around stars. And all of this is not precisely true. Because orbitals are always ellipses. They always have a pair of foci. And just because one of the foci is so dominant, like the sun, doesn't mean that's the center of the sun. That's the center of the orbit. The center of the orbit is the barycenter in between the two foci. It is the mid-space threshold of exchange of forces that is the real pivot. And so we're looking to understand that in experience, the real pivot is not the apparent. It's always the invisible, very near to the apparent. It can only be found by being wise about the resonances in their distribution. And in order to do this and be wise about it, one has to do the rituals precisely, again and again, all the time. And it's the continuity of doing those rituals all the time, as precise as you can, that keep the set close enough that one can come to understand this is really how it is. It's hidden. It's very close to what we are doing, but it is not exactly this time what we're doing, but it's always very close. And so there is not a creativeness about ritual, but there's a deep wisdom experience about doing it, and doing it just so. And with Jane Ellen Harrison, one finds for the first time the ability to see deeply into what is going on here. That mythology is an enormously complex area. Not at all a form, but a process. Central to that process is the location of the rituals, and the experience in the Greeks goes all the way back to the ancient Near East. And in the ancient Near East, one finds that there were two different kinds of temples that were the sites of the cult rituals for the mythologies. And here in a volume by H.W. Heaton, Heaton was a very famous writer on the Old Testament. This is called Solomon's New Men, the emergence of ancient Israel as a nation state, but it's about Solomon's temple. It's about the architecture, the design of Solomon's temple, and about the curious fact that up until Solomon, ancient Israel was just some little outpost. And all of a sudden, in a flourish, it became a very important place because it was the barycenter point between the great Persian empire that had finally taken over, the Neo-Babylonians, and the Egyptian power. And that there, where Jerusalem was the point of the very center. And in the center of Jerusalem, where Solomon's temple was one of the most important places of hidden real estate value in the whole world of that time. And that's why it was put there. And it is called Jerusalem because it means Salem, peace. It's about David's peace. Like Beijing means northern peace. It is a place of equipoise and contending enormous forces going back thousands of years. And at this particular juncture, at this particular place, is an opportunity to have a Sophoclean balance if you could maintain it. And Solomon's temple is made in that way. It is there were two kinds of temples. One is where the temple has its entrance in the side. The other is a temple where the entrance is along one side and you go into the deep access. They have names. The Breitrum, B-R-E-I-T, R-A-U-M. The Breitrum is an oblong room with the opening on one of the middles, one of the long sides. The other is a langrum, Langraum, is an oblong room with the entrance at one end. In a batrum, the center of the temple is largely an open space where the worshipers come in, and they occupy most of it, and the altar is a very small little niche. But in a landrum, they have the long length, and the altar has two steps. It has some place in with a more limited public, and then it has a huge inner sanctum behind it. The altar before is for that public that is allowed to come in and worship, but the inner sanctum is only for the head priest one time each year to go in. And so one has this very interesting kind of a play. One has the worship to keep the natural order healthy, that God is worshipped in this way, but that the inner sanctum is for the supernatural protection, which only the head priest one time during the year dares go in and risk himself at that. And we saw, when we looked at nature and we used beginning Thoreau and the I Ching, we saw that in ancient China, there was always the sense when a new dynasty was being founded, the founder of that dynasty would go to a place, a sacred mountain like Taishan in the Shantung Peninsula, and he would perform the Feng and Shang ceremonies. He would go to the top of the mountain, and he would get heaven's mandate himself alone, and then he would come down from the top of the mountain and deliver it to the people and put the order of the dynasty into the land. Very Moses-like. Very Egyptian also. Because in Pharaonic Egypt, it was always a quality of ritual necessity that after 30 years of being a pharaoh, if you lived that long and lasted that long, your power would have been used up by governing the land in the right conscientious way, and you would have grown a little sloppy about being God's representative on earth. And so they had a festival renewal called the Sed Festival. And the greatest Sed festival in antiquity, in Egypt, in Pharaonic Egypt, was the Sed festival of Amenhotep III. And his son Akhenaten didn't last long enough to have a Sed festival, but it became noticeable because Amenhotep III, the dazzling sun, had 3 Sed festivals, and they left a deep impress so that the Moses-influenced festival, the Seder, is all based on the ancient Egyptian Sed festival, but has a very peculiar kind of an undertow. It has a Persian, Akkadian, ancient Sumerian feeling tone quality that also is there and also must be brought into play. And so one has a very complex thing. And just simply doing the rituals is not enough. Simply knowing the myths is not enough. One has to understand that you're dealing here with phases that flow in a syncopation like a frequency. And that you can't keep track of just the highs or the lows. You have to keep track of the entire ensemble, and so that integration is getting tuned to the frequency of reality. That's what it's all about. That's what we're doing in our education. We're trying to wake up, as James Joyce said, from a nightmare and become real in our own lives. And it ain't that easy. More next week.